Hey, good morning, everybody. So today I would just want to go over what you need to study for the test, which obviously will not be on Monday. I forgot that we are off Monday, and on my calendar I wrote that we are on Monday, but we are obviously off. Oh, hi, buddy. We're making a video. All right, for their test. Can you say hi, everybody?
Hi, everybody.
Okay. Hi, dude. You go back to Mama.
Mama.
Okay. All right, so I'm just going to go over exactly what's on the test. I'm not going to try and trick you guys at all. I'm going to read through the topics on the test and a couple other things I think you should study for. So, there will be a lot on the election of 1860. It'll be a lot on the issue of slavery and expansion into the West. So, when you're looking at some of these issues, you need to be looking at whether or not the differences between the parties, basically. What did the Republicans actually think about slavery at the beginning of the war, and what did the Democrats? You're going to have to look at things like regionalism and sectionalism. How did the North and the West vote differently than the South? How did Southern Democrats different? How are they different from Northern Democrats? And how did this party basically split apart? You'll need to look at things like how immigration really impacted the North politically, as it was driving industrialism, and the South was still agricultural with almost no immigration. What else? Oh, and you also know that the election of 1860 really ended up with the Southern states seceding from the Union. You'll also have to know about immigration at the time. Think back. This goes all the way back to chapter 19, this test. So you'll have to know things about the nativists and what the nativists actually wanted. You'll have to know how immigrants started to go west. And of course, west meant the Midwest, not far west like we think today. You'll have to know about the Irish stayed in New York City and Boston while the Germans went to the Midwest. Think about all those brewing factories in Wisconsin and Milwaukee. Oh, remember, the Irish became Democrats very early on. They were really a part of some of those political machines that are starting to start in the cities. And because of that, nativists thought that the Irish were basically stealing jobs and selling their votes to Democrats. And another thing was they didn't like them because they were Catholic. You will have to know that that many in the North did not support the abolition of slavery. They never did. And it wasn't simply because of racism, although that was certainly a part of it. It was also driven largely by economics. That the Northern workers believed that if the slaves were freed, they would immediately become workers competing with them for their jobs. Another thing is they often were not big fans of living side by side with these freed slaves. Remember that African Americans started joining up in the Union Army as soon as they were allowed to. They felt like they had more to lose in this war, which they clearly did. You'll need to know that free labor, right? This idea of free labor, that workers who are free have more control over their own destiny, was a big part of this as well. So it wasn't all racism, that a lot of these workers were not fans of slavery or fans of it wasn't just racism, it was also economically based. What else? Let's see what else we've got here. Oh, I would encourage you before you take the test to look at the song "Follow the Drinking Gourd." All right, "Follow the Drinking Gourd." An American folk song sung by slaves, and the drinking gourd is obviously in the sky. It's the Big Dipper, and the Big Dipper points true north. So if you're in the south, if you follow the drinking gourd, you will be heading north. So it was a strategy, basically, of the abolitionist movement to encourage slaves to run away, help them escape, and really through the Underground Railroad. And this is one of the reasons why there was so much contention over the Fugitive Slave Act, right? The South sees things like this and they say, the North is actively encouraging slaves to run away, so the Fugitive Slave Act was brought to bear because of this. What else do we want to look at? Okay. So in the mid-1840s, remember that slavery and free labor started to come into more and more conflict. And really the head of this was the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is the moment when the North and South realized that there's going to be a life or death struggle over the issue of slavery and states' rights. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act is really the breaking point in this debate. You'll know that. Okay, so for many people in the South, they thought that really only states should regulate slavery, right? We've talked about this many times. They didn't think that the federal government should have the ability to say to a state that they shouldn't be allowed to have slavery. And in fact, some in the South, like Thomas Jefferson, actually advocated for getting rid of slavery. And although Jefferson's long dead at this point, I really have a hard time believing a person like Jefferson thinking that the federal government should be the one intervening. So this free labor idea that we keep going back to, if we look at this, I'm going to read you the question. How does the idea of free labor, as referenced in the above excerpt, connect to the pro-union stance of northern states? One, many people in the South or in the North were very afraid of the Union breaking up. If the Union broke up, they were going to have a really hard time getting the materials they needed for those Union factories. American or Massachusetts textile factories without cotton are pretty useless, and the people realized that. So when you look at this issue, it is not simply an issue of economics. It is also an issue of how people viewed their own nation. This is why the Civil War is so complicated, because you have economics, you have political ideas like states' rights versus the federal government. You have the way people viewed their own states is all wrapped up into this. As the Whigs fell apart, we have to remember that what really, really brought the North together under the Republican Party was this idea of free labor. So although many people in the North were not anti-slavery, they were not abolitionists, they did believe in this idea of free labor being important to democracy, that people being able to decide their own fates was important because people, free men, could make better decisions for themselves and their families, and they were better citizens. All right. Okay, so remember, when people went into places like Texas, when America took Texas, slavery was a big part of that. It was an extension of that cash crop agricultural system in the South. That's why people wanted to extend slavery into the West, to extend this cash crop culture and economy. Remember, when Texas comes in, there are a lot of people who did not like the idea because they thought it was going to extend the power of Southerners in the political realm. They thought that they opposed adding this huge amount of land because they knew slavery was going to be added to the Union as well. It's all about that balance between northern and southern states, free and slave states, that was established in the Missouri Compromise. What else? One of the big issues for the South going into the Civil War was that they knew they were so outnumbered. So the South had a much larger mobilization of people than the North did. You know, a lot of people in the North went about their daily lives, went to work in their factories or on their farms, and not much changed for them. Unless you had a son between the ages of 18 and 30, you really didn't worry about it too much. In the South, that was not true. Everyone was mobilized. Young men, older men. By the end of the war, they have men in their 50s fighting. Women started to run towns because they were so outmanned, outpopulated. Remember, Southern Democrats were by far the most ardent supporters of secession. Many Northern Democrats didn't even support it. The other thing was, when we look at the Emancipation Proclamation and the end of slavery in the South, it really did decimate the Southern economy as slaves started to run away. You should know that as well. Remember, before Abraham Lincoln became president, he was not exactly he was not an abolitionist. I'm going to read you guys a quote quickly, okay? He said, as a nation, we began declaring that all men are created equal. We now practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. So what he's saying is, even before he was an abolitionist, he thought slavery was wrong. He thought slavery was wrong. Here's a great quote. He says, "When it comes to this issue, meaning slavery, I should prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty, to Russia, for instance." So he's saying, even though we say all men are created equal, we don't mean it. So Lincoln sometimes gets criticized for not being an abolitionist before the war. He knew it wouldn't work. Lincoln, in all things, is very practical. He realizes that if the federal government says no slaves, he knows that the Union will break apart. And he knows that states like Maryland and Kentucky that were willing to go along with the gradual emancipation of slavery never would have if it had just been the federal government stepping in. You have to know about the Know Nothing Party, those nativists. You'll have to know about those who opposed abolition, mainly some workers in the North. Largely immigrants were not fans of abolition because of that. Democrats were not a fan of this. You'll have to know about Frederick Douglass, and you'll have to know about the Dred Scott decision. You'll have to know about the Dred Scott decision, how people who were enslaved were now considered property. They were not allowed to be citizens under the decision, even though that was not what the Founding Fathers had envisioned. What else? All right, you'll have to know about slave revolts and how these slave revolts really, really scared people, how they really made people nervous and uncomfortable. And that some abolitionists were willing to, like John Brown, were willing to use violence. And this really sparked the South because they did not see the North rising up and saying that it was wrong or that it was dangerous. So the John Brown raid, especially at Harper's Ferry, really, really scared a lot of people in the North. What else? I dread Scott again. I'm not going to make you guys do any writing. This will just be multiple choice, okay? So it'll be 25, I'm not sure yet, 25 to 35 multiple choice questions. I will post it on Tuesday, and I'll write when it's due for each class in the notes. So feel free to email me any questions you have, even over the weekend. I'll get back to you. Go look over your notes, well, the PowerPoints, watch those videos, and watch others' videos as well. John Brown videos are pretty good. I'm sorry, John Brown. John Green. I got my colors mixed up. The John Green Crash Course videos. All right, talk to you guys soon.